All right, good evening. Welcome to the Lowly Shepherd podcast. I'm your host, as always, Pastor Jay. And as I mentioned last week, we're going to start getting into that verse-by-verse Bible study on the book of Ephesians. And by way of a preface to that, I guess this week, I wanted to kind of separate out. Originally, I had planned on doing this as a part of the introduction, which will be now next week. The introduction on Ephesians, we'll talk about authorship and recipients and dating and setting and key themes and purposes and things like that. And we'll talk about that next week. And hopefully my good friend Travis Welch will be with us for the rest of this series for that, starting next week. And I planned on doing this segment as a sort of a tag on at the end of that one, but I wanted to pull this out and do its own thing this week. I want to talk about my top 5 commentary recommendations for the book of Ephesians. As I mentioned at the beginning of the year, for this podcast, I wanted to make content that is easily accessible and usable for part-time pastors, even full-time pastors, busy pastors, even lay persons that are Sunday school teachers and whatnot, or just anybody that wants to do basic Bible study. And I wanted to be able to do this, and I figured something like commentary searches. I know I've done that myself, and trying to find what are the best commentaries on any given book of the Bible. And so I wanted to kind of give sort of a mini review of my recommendations of the top 5 commentaries. And much like many of these types of videos, there are actually about 10 or 11 that I'm actually going to mention because I'll have my honorable mentions and whatnot. But I do want to kind of list off my top recommendations for commentaries. And so I'm going to jump right into it. There are a couple of issues that you need to keep in mind when you're looking for commentaries on the book of Ephesians. And we'll get into this in a couple weeks when we get into chapter 1 of Ephesians on the actual verse-by-verse study. But chapter 1, verses 3 through 14, contains some theologically charged words like predetermined or predestined or elected or chosen. And there's a lot of Reformed theology and Calvinistic theology that goes with that, and that's, of course, one of their favorite passages they like to use to espouse their viewpoints. And so any commentary that you're looking at, really you can look at certain passages like that to kind of see, okay, where's this commentator going to go based upon this? And so we'll talk a little bit about that, but there are some things you need to know there. There's also some questions about the authorship, which we'll get into detail next week. At least one of these commentaries that I'm going to mention today does not believe that Paul actually wrote the book to Ephesians. And so if that's a problem for you, you need to be aware of that before you pick up that commentary. Because for the most part, in this particular case, it doesn't affect his exegetical study of the book of Ephesians, but there are a couple of places where it does sort of influence it. And so that assumption that he makes, that Paul did not write it. So just keep those things in mind. So jumping into it, my number 5 commentary that I recommend is the NIV Application Commentary by a guy named, and I hope I pronounced this correctly, Klein Snodgrass, which is quite a name. Might be Snoodgrass, but I think it's Snodgrass. I'm not sure. But I'm a big fan of this series. I have a number of these, probably at least a dozen of these commentaries, Old and New Testament, on the NIV Application series. These are some good, just solid pastoral commentaries. Usually I will turn to one of these at the end if I'm preparing a sermon for the week, because whereas they have excellent exegetical breakdowns, verse by verse, kind of going through, or at least section by section, going through exegetical commentary on the passage. Where I find their greatest value is in the 2 sections that they call bridging context, which is what we talked about a couple of weeks ago about kind of bridging that hermeneutical gap between the there and then and the here and now. Some issues. It's like, here are the principles that you can pull out that we can kind of bridge to where we are now. And then it has a contemporary application section, which is somewhat similar but also different in a lot of respects, and there are different issues that they pull up in this series. And so I like this series for that. It's very, very helpful for sermon preparation, for illustrations, for finding application and things like that. Although, like I said, the exegetical commentary is also good, but I think there are other commentaries that do it better as far as I'm concerned personally. But I love those sections of it. So I definitely recommend this one. This Ephesian commentary, like I said, they do great exegetical work. This is one of the better ones that I have found. There are a number of these that are really, really good. Some of them are not as good as others. This is one of the better ones, and I highly recommend this commentary, the NIV Application Commentary on Ephesians by Klein Snodgrass. My number 4 commentary recommendation, which might surprise some people if you're familiar, because it's kind of low on the list, but is the New International Commentary on the New Testament by F.F. Bruce. And this is actually on the epistles to the Colossians, Philemon, and Ephesians. So it's a little light as far as page count and content, because it's probably about a 400 or 500 page book. Let's see. Yeah, it's a 400-page book, but of that, only maybe 100, 150 pages are actually devoted to Ephesians. And so it's kind of light compared to a lot of these other commentaries that I'm going to be talking about. But that being said, F.F. Bruce is one of the premier New Testament scholars of the last generation. And so you're not going to go wrong with anything from F.F. Bruce. And so this has been the gold standard for many, many years. And this one's been around for a while. I want to say 80s. When was this one written? 1984. Yeah, so this one's been around for a while. Now, there actually are some newer, updated commentaries in this series. They do revisions and do updated ones from time to time. Ones that have been done recently, there was one, I want to say off the top of my head, I think it was Scott McKnight that did one on the Colossians, and maybe Philemon too. And then there's one that's come out recently, I want to say 2020, that was by a lady named Lynn Cohick that did on Ephesians. Now, I would like to review that one, but I don't have that one. I've not purchased that one, just haven't had opportunity to get hold of it. From the reviews and the comments that I've seen, it seems to be a worthy replacement to this original one from F.F. Bruce, and she brings some interesting female perspectives, and her studies and her emphasis and her PhD background are in women's studies from New Testament perspectives, in marriage contracts and marriage, covenant relationships and how those things worked. And so that particularly will be influential in like Ephesians 5 when you get into the household codes and things like that. I've heard that she brings some unique perspectives and things that you may not have seen before. But like I said, I can't review that one because I don't have it. But that is one that's kind of on my list that I kind of want to try to pick up at some point. But until then, we're still going with the good old F.F. Bruce at number 4 for that. My number 3 commentary, I don't have that one physically, as I mentioned before. About half and half on my commentaries are digital or on Logos software. This one I have digitally is the Baker Exegetical Commentary on the New Testament. The Baker Exegetical Commentary series is excellent. Just about every one of those commentaries you're not going to go wrong with. They are all excellent. The layout and the way that they have arranged it is very, very easy to read and easy to follow. I can't recommend it highly enough. The Baker Exegetical Commentary on Ephesians is by Frank Thielman. I think I'm saying that right. Thielman. And he actually is an expert in Ephesians and in Ephesus, and he's done a lot of his PhD work, and a lot of his area of expertise is in sort of that early first century Greek sort of culture and background around that area in Asia Minor. And so he brings a lot to the table as far as the cultural background of Ephesians that will play out in the actual commentary that he writes. And so I highly recommend that series as well, the Baker Exegetical Commentary. That's my number 3. Now, my number 2 recommended commentary, this is another one that I only have in digital format. Originally, it was just in digital. It was written for or made exclusively for Logos Bible software, I think. And it's only been in the recent years that they've actually printed it out in physical editions. So I don't have the physical edition. I only have a digital version of this. Is the Evangelical Exegetical Commentary series on Ephesians by S.M. Baugh, B-A-U-G-H, I believe is how it's pronounced, Baugh. And this is excellent. I love this series. This guy has done an amazing job and really brings some unique perspectives in a couple of passages. I mean, and I haven't even read all of this one yet. It's just I have had it for years and just kind of pulled it out as I'm getting ready to do this series on Ephesians. I haven't preached in Ephesians in a while, and so I've only kind of glanced through it. But I mean, just from what I've looked at, I'm really enjoying the readability of it, and yet the depth of what he brings to the table, and some comments that are even kind of unique. So he's not just rehashing F.F. Bruce or some of these other guys, even though he does reference them or quote them and in the footnotes and whatnot from time to time. But he's really kind of bringing his own perspective on this, and of course his background also is an area of expertise is in Ephesians and Ephesus and the ancient Asia Minor studies and things like that. And so he's bringing some good expertise to that as well. So that's my number 2 recommendation at this time. Now, before I get into my number 1, which I'm going to give you a preview, my number 1 is actually 2, and so I know I'm kind of cheating again, but so I have a 1A and a 1B. But before I get into that, I wanted to kind of mention some of my honorable mentions. And these are all of these are excellent commentaries. I recommend all of them. I just couldn't fit them all into my top 5. Maybe I should have just done a top 10. I don't know. But I'm going to mention these. The Word Biblical Commentary by Andrew Lincoln is considered gold standard by most critical scholars. I mean, if you're looking for text critical issues and the proper conjunctions of the verbs and the exegetical breakdowns of the Greek parsings and things like that, you're not going to go wrong with the Word Biblical Commentary series as a whole. But Andrew Lincoln is absolutely phenomenal in that regard, and so this is considered gold standard. So when I'm wanting to do a word study, when I'm wanting to really kind of dig into a particular passage or phrasing in the Greek in the book of Ephesians, this is the one that I turn to. The only caveat I have, and the reason he's kind of further down on the list, at least as far as I am concerned, is 2 reasons. Number 1, this is the guy I was mentioned earlier. He does not believe that Paul wrote the book of Ephesians, and he writes a pretty lengthy argument that's actually a fairly well-reasoned argument for why Paul didn't write the book to Ephesians, or the letter to the Ephesians. But I disagree with that, and I think the arguments for are much greater than the arguments against, although he does write a compelling argument and reason for it. He devotes quite a number of pages to that. The other reason is I'm just not a fan of the Word Biblical Commentary format. It's just not easy to read. I remember even going back to my seminary days, and Word Biblical Commentaries were almost always on the list of any paper you're writing because, like I said, they're just one of those top-ranked critical series. But man, are they annoying to try to read and dig through. They're boring. They're boring to read. And so it's just the format. It's not that his content is bad. His content is great, and actually his is one of the more readable ones that I've seen. I just really hate the format of the Word Biblical Commentary series, and so I'm not sure what it is. It just doesn't. Maybe graphically it just doesn't look as good as like the Baker, for example, or the Zondervan that we'll talk about in a minute. But I'm just not a fan of that format, and so that's why he's right outside. He might be 6 or 7, but this is definitely one of the top commentaries to consider as well. One that I'm going to mention I don't own, I haven't read, but I've seen great reviews on is the Brian Chappell's commentary out of the Reformed Exegetical Commentary series. Now, the caveat to that is, of course, the word is Reformed, and so you're going to get the Reformed Calvinistic perspective on Ephesians 1 and other places in the book of Ephesians, and so if you're not buying into that line of theology, then this commentary is going to be less useful to you. Although I've heard great comments and reviews on this, and so I would recommend it from that regard. It's widely considered in the top 10, commentaries to consider for the book of Ephesians. One I do recommend that I have just about every commentary in the New Testament in this series is the John MacArthur New Testament Commentary series. These are not highly critical. They're not, scholarly tomes. These are more for pastoral use. So if you're a pastor, and especially if you're, preparing for a Sunday school class or a Bible study or even personal Bible study, I would turn to this first before anything else, honestly, because he does excellent exegetical work. He actually does really good deep research in a lot of places. Whereas I don't agree 100% with everything that John MacArthur teaches or believes, I'm in line with, I'm tracking with a lot of what he says, and so there's not a whole lot of places where I'm going to disagree with him. And so I find in his commentaries are highly readable and very, very useful for sermon preparation and Bible study. And so I highly recommend the MacArthur series on the book of Ephesians here as well. Another good one, and this is just another good series, is the Bible Speaks Today series and the Message of Ephesians by John Stott. And it's just a tiny little book, and I have this one in digital format, so I don't have it to show you, but I want to say it's only like 120, 150 pages. These are really, really good, and they do give, he gives passage by passage commentary, but its main goal is to give you kind of the overall message and the overall themes and kind of key ideas and main ideas of each section. And he does an excellent job of that. When you're a pastor, you're trying to find that main idea of a passage to be able to kind of break it down for your congregation. And so that's an excellent book to be able to do that. I love that series. And just about every book at least all the books that I own from that series are excellent that I have seen. And so I recommend that one. The last one I'm going to mention as we're getting ready to go into my top picks is the Pillar New Testament Commentary series, which I recommend that series as well. Most every one of the commentaries I've seen in that series are all top quality, excellent ones. The one on Ephesians is written by a guy named Peter O'Brien. Now, I would tell you, if it weren't for this one major issue, this would be hands down my top number one pick. And the ones I'm going to mention would be 2A and 2B. This would be my top pick. The reason why it's in the honorable mentions and not actually on my list is for one major reason. Unfortunately, a few years ago, Peter O'Brien was found out to have plagiarized, and so there is significant evidence. Most prevalent in his, I believe it's also the Pillar New Testament series on the book of Hebrews, which was considered at the time the number one top commentary on Hebrews. I actually own that one, and I don't have the physical copy, but I fortunately have the digital copy version of Ephesians commentary, and I do use it, and I love it. But because of the plagiarism issue, and it was, he wrote an apology and everything, and he says it was not intentional, and it might not have been intentional. It just seems like really, really bad scholarship. He basically quoted word for word some people and didn't cite them as some of the examples that I have seen. So it's pretty bad, and to the point where the publishers from, pretty much every commentary that he has written in a couple of different series, not just Pillar, have been pulled by the publishers. And so obviously the plagiarism is a big issue. You can't use those commentaries for academic work. If you're a seminary student, you're wanting to write a commentary, write a paper using this commentary, not going to happen because of the plagiarism. You're going to have to scrap that and find it somewhere else. From my perspective, the plagiarism is less of an issue because all of these commentaries are just giving me stuff to preach, and so I'm not that worried about that. There's the ethical concerns, but as far as using the information, it's not that big of a deal for me. The biggest problem and the reason why I can't recommend it to you is because they have been pulled by the publisher, they are impossible to find. And if you can find one, you're going to pay a bunch of money for it. I've seen ones going for upwards of $400 and $500 on Amazon or online stores. And so I am fortunate, like I said, to have this copy that I had from years and years ago I got a couple of years before the whole plagiarism thing went down. And so I'm fortunate to already have that. But if you were trying to find a copy of this Pillar commentary on Ephesians by Peter O'Brien, you're not going to find it. I did a search yesterday just trying to see if I could even find one on Amazon. None, not one. And so that's why I can't recommend it. It's an honorable mention because if you can't get your hands on it and you're not going to pay, more than, it's probably worth $30 or $40. If you pay, much more than that, it's not going to be worth it. But if you're paying, a ton of money, if you can find it and you're not having to pay a ton of money, you find it at a, used bookstore or at a garage sale, then great. I recommend it. Pick it up. It's one of the top commentaries. If you don't mind, or you can overlook, I guess, the plagiarism ethic issue. But otherwise, that's why it's on honorable mentions and not in the top of the list. So, that being said, let's get to my top top two, 1A and 1B, my top commentaries on the book of Ephesians. And these are the commentaries that I turn to first. And I'm going to mention sort of 1B, I guess, first. And is this book by Harold Hoehner, I guess is how it's pronounced. It's Hoehner, Hoehner. This thing is almost 1,000 pages long. This is hands down the most comprehensive exegetical commentary on the book of Ephesians in the world, at least in the modern era. And this gentleman was a professor at Dallas Theological Seminary for a number of years. This was his magnum opus. I mean, this was his masterpiece, his Mona Lisa, and every page just shows. This commentary is particularly useful, and I've already been into this one as I'm getting ready to do the introduction for the book of Ephesians next week. This commentary, more than any other commentary, interacts with, is probably the most in-depth research into the authorship of the book of Ephesians than any other commentary. I mean, he gives, I want to say 65 pages at the beginning of this book just talking about the authorship, and he defends the authorship of Ephesians as being Pauline. And he covers every angle and every basis that you can imagine. And so if you have serious questions about the authorship of Ephesians and you wanted to know what all the arguments are from all the other commentators that have been around for years, well, I mean, even back into ancient times, this is the commentary to turn to. He shows that same kind of devotion and digging in just about every passage in the book of Ephesians. Like I said, you're talking 1,000-page book on a little 6-chapter letter of Ephesians, and so this book is very, very comprehensive. Now, that being said, the reason it's not hands down number one is because, as one reviewer said, I kind of like the way he worded it. He definitely, he doesn't just miss the forest for the trees by focusing on the trees. He dissects the trees. He cuts them down, cuts them in half, dissects them, digs under the roots, and digs down into the mud underneath the trees. This guy digs deep. And so if you're wanting to chase every possible rabbit trail, every possible, connotation of every single, word and phrase in the Greek in the book of Ephesians, this is the book for you. But it does kind of lose the main idea, the main focus, and the main point of the arguments that Paul is making, missing the forest for the trees by focusing in so much. So I recommend, this is my top-rated one, my 1A. This is Clinton Arnold's commentary in the Zondervan Exegetical Commentary series on Ephesians. And this one's about 400 or 500 pages. It's 400 pages long. And this one is excellent. Once again, I can't recommend this one highly enough. I love this commentary series. I have a number, probably half a dozen in the New Testament on this series. I love the arrangement. I love the layout. It gives you the actual Greek, not transliterated, the actual Greek. And so if you know Greek, you're able to see that and word it with the translation that they give. It goes section by section and gives wonderful exegetical commentary. And then it has, I believe it's Theology in Action, it's called, or Theology in Application maybe, section at the end where it breaks it down and gives you, it's not just a critical exegetical commentary, it gives you actual practical application for this passage as well. This is my top recommendation for the book of Ephesians, this series book and the Zondervan Exegetical Commentary series. I use this one first. When I'm looking at a passage in Ephesians, this is where I go first, and when I want to dig deeper, I go to Hoehner to dig into the deeper sections, and then I go to these other ones as well. So there are my top 5 commentary picks for the book of Ephesians. And so comment in the comments below if you guys have other commentaries that you have used that you highly recommend. Throw those down in the comments and below, and we'll be able to add those in the list. These are just my personal recommendations. It's all based on opinion. I hope I've given you a good idea of where you can go as you're getting ready to prepare to study for this series that we're going to be starting next week. So next week, hopefully my buddy Travis will be with us, and we'll be starting the introduction into the book of Ephesians. See you guys next time. Have a great week.